Please don't let go until the storm passes.
I'm not going anywhere.
Attention viewer, you loved our short films, so now we want to make a full 1-hour movie. Once we reach 100 Patreon members, production can officially begin. Thank you to everyone already supporting us. Scan the code or click the link below to join, and help us make this movie possible.
There was a saying among the rescue crews stationed along the Kestrel corridor: "If the sky is trying to kill you, send Rook." Marek Vale had heard it 100 times before he ever met her, tossed around break rooms and fueling bays like a piece of folklore nobody bothered to question. Captain Avenna Rook had flown into the collapsing ice shelf at Vulpine Station and pulled out 4 glaciologists 11 minutes before the whole platform sheared into the sea. She had threaded a supply skiff through the burning debris field over Corvale when the orbital tether snapped, weaving between chunks of flaming wreckage the size of houses without so much as scraping her paint. She had landed on a listing, half-submerged cargo hauler in a hurricane and walked out with 19 souls and a dislocated shoulder she didn't mention until the debrief was over. Marek had expected, when he was assigned as her flight engineer 3 years ago, to meet someone loud. Someone with the swagger that usually came bundled with that kind of reputation, the kind of person who told the story before you could ask for it. Instead, he'd found a quiet woman with steady amber eyes and a tail that never stopped moving, checking pre-flight manifests with the same unhurried care she gave everything else, like the universe had all the time in the world, and so did she. "You're new," she'd said without looking up from her clipboard. "Transferred in. Marek Vale." "I know who you are, Vale. I read the file." She'd finally glanced up, and something in her face, amusement maybe, or the fox-shaped version of it, had made the corner of her mouth twitch. "I meant you're new to this. To flying with someone who doesn't turn back." He hadn't turned back either, not once, in 3 years. That was the thing people didn't understand about Avenna Rook from the outside. It wasn't recklessness. It was the opposite. She was the most controlled person he'd ever worked beside, precise to the point of unsettling, every decision run through some private calculus that always, somehow, came out in favor of go. Vulpines were like that in general, he'd learned, creatures of instinct wearing the discipline of long civilization over top, the tail and ears telegraphing truths the mouth was too proud to say. But Avenna's instincts and her discipline had fused into something singular. She didn't fight her fear the way humans were taught to. She simply, as far as anyone could tell, didn't have any. Marek had come to understand, over 3 years of shared cockpits and shared silences, that this wasn't quite true. He'd seen the tail, once or twice, and never mentioned it, the way her tail, when they were inbound to something truly bad, would go very still. Not calm still. Coiled still. A held breath with fur on it. He thought, on the morning of the supply run to the Syndril outposts, that he understood everything about Avenna Rook that he was ever going to be allowed to understand. He was wrong about that too. The run should have taken 6 hours. A milk route job, Avenna called it, ferrying medical supplies and hydroponic seed stock out to 3 remote settlements clinging to the Syndril Highlands, the kind of assignment senior captains got as a rest between the missions that actually made the news. Marek liked these flights. He liked watching Avenna fly for the pure competent joy of it instead of the adrenaline, humming some tuneless little song under her breath as the terrain scrolled beneath them, her ears swiveling lazily toward the calm chatter and away again. "You're quiet today," she said 3 hours in, banking the craft around a ridge of red stone. "Thinking. Dangerous habit for a flight engineer." Her tail flicked, once, against the back of her seat. A gesture he'd learned to read as good humor. "What about? The weather report doesn't like us," she snorted. "The weather report doesn't like anybody. It's a weather report. It exists to be disappointed in people's outdoor plans. There's a front coming in off the Kessin Range. Fast moving. Command flagged it an hour ago. We'll be down at Syndril 3 before it arrives. That's the theory. I don't deal in theories, Vale. I deal in flight paths." But she said it lightly, and when he glanced at the instrument panel a moment later he saw she'd already pulled up the weather overlay herself, her eyes narrowing at whatever she saw there. Her ears had gone very slightly flat. He didn't comment on it. In 3 years he had learned exactly when not to. The front, as it turned out, was not moving at the speed anyone had predicted. Fronts along the Kessin Range rarely did. The mountains funneled weather systems into shapes the models struggled to anticipate, compressing what should have been a gentle afternoon squall into something with teeth. By the time the first static crackled through their comms, the sky ahead had gone the color of a fresh bruise, seams of lightning stitching through clouds that seemed to be boiling rather than simply moving. Sindel 3, this is Rescue 7, do you copy? Avenna said, voice perfectly level. Requesting updated ceiling conditions, over. Silence, then garbled static, then nothing. We've lost them, Marek said. I noticed. Her hands were steady on the yoke, but he saw her tail curl tight against her hip, out of the way, out of sight, the way she tucked it when she needed her whole body available for a fight. We're not going to make 3 in this. We're not going to make anywhere in this, not on this heading. There's an old weather station on the charts. Decommissioned, maybe 15 minutes northeast. Show me. He pulled the coordinates up and threw them to her display. She studied the readout for exactly 2 seconds, he counted, an old habit, a way of gauging how bad things were by how long she needed to decide, and then banked hard, the whole craft groaning as wind shear caught the wings. Hold on, Vale. Always do, Captain. The next 15 minutes were the kind of flying that made the Rook legend, though no one would ever hear about this one, because no one had died and nothing had exploded, and the only witness was a flight engineer who already knew better than to be surprised. She threaded the storm the way she threaded everything, economically, without waste, finding the 6-second gaps between downdrafts, and using every one of them. Lightning split the sky close enough that Marek felt his teeth ache with the static charge. The weather station appeared out of the murk like something conjured rather than found, a squat gray shape hunched against the ridge, and Avenna put them down on the cracked landing pad with a bump that was, under the circumstances, close enough to gentle that Marek didn't bother to brace. The engines wound down. Outside, the storm screamed against the hull like something with a grievance. Well, Avenna said, unbuckling. That's one way to see the local architecture. Marek looked at her, really looked, the way he sometimes let himself when the adrenaline was still working its way out of his blood and his guard was down enough to notice things he usually filed away. Her tail was tucked so tightly around herself it had nearly disappeared beneath the edge of her flight jacket. Her ears, usually mobile and expressive, were pinned flat against her skull. You okay? He asked. Fine, she said too quickly, already moving toward the hatch. Let's find out if this place still has power. He let her go first. He always let her go first. It had taken him a year to understand that this wasn't deference. It was that Avenna Rook needed, more than almost anything, to be the one who walked into a room before anyone else did, and he had decided somewhere in that first year that he would rather give her that than argue about it. He did not yet understand why. The weather station had been abandoned for a decade, according to the corroded plaque bolted beside its outer door, a research outpost that had lost its funding when the atmospheric survey it supported got folded into a larger program, leaving behind 3 rooms, a bank of dead consoles, and the particular smell of a building that had spent 10 years arguing with dust and losing. Charming, Avenna said, sweeping her flashlight across the main room. I've stayed in worse. You've stayed in a burning cargo ship. I said worse, not more interesting. But her voice had a brittle quality to it that hadn't been there an hour ago, and Marek noted it the way he noted everything about her lately, filed, catalogued, never mentioned. The transmitter array on the roof, they discovered within 20 minutes, had taken storm damage sometime in the years since the station's abandonment. A length of cable had corroded through, and the receiver dish sat at a defeated angle that suggested it hadn't successfully caught a signal since long before tonight. If they wanted to reach Syndrome 3, or anyone, they'd need to fix it. If they wanted to fix it, someone would need to go up on the roof, in the storm, and that someone was clearly going to be Marek, since Avenna's expertise ran toward flying things and not toward the delicate business of splicing damaged cable in the dark. "I'll get the emergency lighting rig down here," she said, when he told her his plan. "Shout if you need a hand. You hate being useless." "I don't hate being useless. I've simply never had the opportunity to practice it." A ghost of her usual dryness. He held onto it like a good sign. He worked on the transmitter for the better part of an hour, soaked through despite the tarp he'd rigged, hands going numb around the splicing tool while thunder detonated overhead with a violence that seemed personal. By the time he had the array limping along well enough to send a distress ping, not a full signal, but something, a heartbeat instead of a voice, he was cold enough that his teeth had started up their own conversation, and he was more than ready to get back inside. He found the main room empty. "Avenna?" No answer. The emergency lighting she'd promised sat half-rigged in the corner, one strand run and glowing weakly, the rest coiled and abandoned on the floor as though she'd simply stopped in the middle of the task. He checked the second room. Storage, empty shelves, nothing, and then, on instinct he couldn't have named, the smaller room at the end of the hall, the one that had probably once been an office. The door was ajar. He pushed it open slowly. She was on the floor beneath the ruined control console, knees drawn up to her chest, back pressed into the corner where two walls and the underside of the desk met. Her ears were flat against her skull, flatter than he had ever seen them, and her tail, that magnificent, expressive, constantly moving tail that punctuated every sentence she'd ever spoken to him, was wrapped so tightly around her own body that it looked less like an animal appendage and more like a rope she'd used to tie herself together. Outside, thunder cracked, close enough to rattle the window frame. Avenna flinched. Not a small flinch. A full body, teeth bared, eyes screwed shut flinch, the kind of reaction Marek had seen exactly once before in his life, on a rescue survivor pulled shaking from a building that had, moments earlier, been trying to kill her. "Avenna." He kept his voice low, the way he'd learned to keep his voice low around anything wounded and cornered. He crouched in the doorway rather than approaching, giving her room, the way you gave a spooked animal room. "Hey. It's just me." Her eyes opened. For one unguarded second, before whatever discipline she kept wrapped around herself the rest of the time could reassert its grip, he saw something in her face that he had genuinely never expected to see there, raw, unmanaged terror. Marek. His name came out of her thin, almost apologetic. "I need." She stopped. Swallowed. He watched her try, visibly, to gather the pieces of herself back into the shape of the captain he knew, and watched her fail. "I don't want you to see this." "See what?" "You sitting down?" "I do it all the time, it's very ordinary." He kept his tone light, deliberately, giving her an exit she didn't take. "You know what I mean." He did. He crouched there in the doorway a moment longer, weighing every option he had, and then did the only thing that felt right, which was to sit down on the floor across from her, not close, not crowding, just present, and wait. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "The transmitter's rigged. We've got heat, we've got the lights half up, and we've got until this storm blows through, which the forecast says is maybe 4 hours. I'm not in a hurry. I could tell you I'm fine. You could. I wouldn't believe you, but you could." A sound came out of her that might, in a less catastrophic context, have been a laugh. It cracked in the middle. Thunder rolled again, farther off this time, and still she pressed herself harder into the corner, tail coiling tighter. "I don't do this," she said, mostly to her own knees. "I don't, Marek. I have flown into burning ships. I have landed on ice that was actively breaking apart beneath the gear. I am not." Her voice snagged. "I'm not supposed to be like this. Everybody's like something," he said quietly. "You've just never let me see which something you are." She looked up at him then, amber eyes bright and wet in the low emergency light, and he understood, with the particular clarity that sometimes arrives at the worst and most inconvenient moments, that he was not looking at a captain, or a legend, or a story people told in break rooms. He was looking at a person. He thought he might have been waiting 3 years for the chance to see her this clearly, without meaning to wait for it at all. "Tell me," he said. "Or don't. Either way, I'm staying." Outside, the storm did not care about any of it, and screamed on. It took her a long time to start. Marek didn't push. He'd learned patience the hard way, in a job that punished impatience with bodies, and he sat with his back against the doorframe and let the silence do the work that words couldn't. When she finally spoke, her voice had none of its usual crispness. It came out young, in a way that made him ache for a version of her he had never met and never would, except in the words she was about to give him. "I was 7, she said. "We lived in the Ashvale settlement. You won't know it. It doesn't exist anymore, not even as ruins. The ground took it back a long time ago. It was built into the side of a valley. Terraced. My grandmother used to say it looked like the mountain had grown houses instead of trees." Her tail loosened, fractionally, as though the memory required a different kind of grip than the fear did. There was a storm. Not worse than tonight, honestly, if I'm being precise about it. An ordinary bad storm. The kind that happened every few years and everyone knew the drill for. But the ground had been saturated for weeks before it. Nobody thought about that. Why would they? They weren't engineers. They were farmers and weavers and a schoolteacher who used to let me stay late to read the star charts. Something crossed her face, too brief to name. The thunder started around dusk. I remember my mother telling me to help my little brother with the shutters, because he was frightened of the sound and I wasn't. I was never frightened of the sound, that's the joke of it. I used to love thunderstorms, used to sit at the window and count the gap between the flash and the crack like it was a game. Marek said nothing. He had a terrible suspicion where this was going, and no intention of making her arrive there any faster than she needed to. "There was a crack," Avenna said, louder than the others. "Different. I didn't know, then, that a landslide doesn't always sound like something falling. Sometimes it sounds like the world clearing its throat." Her voice had gone very flat, very careful, the voice of someone reciting something they had rehearsed telling themselves for 20 years so it would never surprise them again. The upper terraces went first. Then the ones below them. It took less than a minute, Marek. Less than a minute, and Ashvale was a scar on a hillside instead of a home. "Your family." "My brother was with me. We were in the lower house, near the treeline, and the slide missed us by, I still don't know, 100 meters. Less. My mother and father were at the community hall on the upper terrace, helping the schoolteacher secure the archive room." She said it without inflection, the way you say a thing you have said to yourself 10,000 times, wearing all the edges smooth. "They didn't get out, Avenna. I sat with my brother in the mud for 6 hours before the rescue skiffs found us, because the storm hadn't finished, and no one could fly in it, and every minute we waited I could hear the thunder telling me it wasn't over yet, that it might come back and finish what it started." Her tail, which had loosened, tightened again, curling around her own waist like something trying to hold her together by main force. "I promised myself, that night, in the mud, listening to my brother cry and the thunder keep threatening us, I promised I would never again be the person waiting in the dark for someone to come. I would be the someone who came. That's why you fly. That's why I fly into everything everyone else flies away from." A small, humorless smile. "It's a very tidy explanation for a career, isn't it? Trauma with excellent operational outcomes." "It's not tidy," Marek said. "It's the bravest thing I've ever heard, and I fly with you into fires for a living." She looked at him properly then, something raw and unguarded moving across her face. "It isn't bravery if the thing underneath it never actually goes away. I've spent 20 years outrunning a storm that lives in my own skull, Marek. I don't fear the missions. I fear the sound. Every single time it thunders, some part of me is 7 years old again, sitting in the mud, waiting for someone who isn't coming." Another crack of thunder hit, closer than the last, and this time Marek watched the whole transformation happen in real time, watched Captain Avenna Rook, decorated rescue pilot, savior of ice shelves and burning ships, disappear entirely behind the eyes of a frightened child who had once waited 6 hours in the mud and never quite stopped waiting. She made a small sound, pressed her palms flat against her own ears, and Marek, without deciding to, without weighing the wisdom of it or the risk to 3 years of careful professional distance, crossed the small space between them and sat down beside her, close enough that his shoulder touched hers. "I'm here," he said. "This storm isn't going to take anything from you tonight. Not while I'm sitting right here. You can't promise that." "No," he agreed. "But I can promise I'm not leaving, and that's the part that's actually mine to give." For a long moment she simply breathed, ragged and uneven, her tail a tight knot against her side. Then, slowly, like something being decided one vertebra at a time, her tail began to uncurl. Marek did not, at first, understand what was happening. He had worked alongside Vulpines for the better part of a decade, had read the cultural briefings every human posted near a Vulpine settlement was required to complete, had absorbed the broad strokes the way one absorbs any information one doesn't expect to need personally. Tails were expressive, tails telegraphed emotion the way a human face might, tails were, in some deep evolutionary sense, load-bearing organs of trust as much as balance. What none of the briefings had adequately conveyed, what he only understood in the specific, overwhelming moment it was happening to him, was what it meant for a Vulpine to offer the physical control of that appendage to someone else. He had seen Vulpine parents groom their children's tails. He had, once, at a wedding he'd been invited to as a courtesy guest, seen two mates twine their tails together during the ceremony, and had understood, distantly, that this was significant, the way you understand a foreign custom is significant without feeling its weight. He had never seen a Vulpine offer their tail, unguarded and unbraided, into the hands of someone outside their family. Avenna's tail slid free of its tight coil, trembling visibly, and moved. Not randomly, not by accident, but with clear and terrified intention, across the short distance between them, until the soft, storm-damp end of it came to rest against his open palm. "Avenna," he said carefully. "What are you?" "I need you to hold my tail," she said, "until the storm passes." The words landed in him with a weight he hadn't been prepared for. He understood, in a rush, everything the cultural briefings had gestured at and never quite explained. That this was not a small thing, not a casual comfort like a held hand might be among his own people. This was Avenna Rook, who did not ask for help, who had built her entire adult life around never again being the one who waited for rescue, placing the single most vulnerable part of herself into his hands and asking him to hold it steady. "Avenna, I know what this means to your people," he said gently, giving her every chance to take it back, to laugh it off, to blame the storm and pretend this hadn't happened. "I don't want you doing something you'll regret because you're frightened." Her ears, which had been pinned flat, tilted toward him, a small, deliberate motion, the first controlled thing she'd done since he'd found her on the floor. "I know exactly what it means," she said. "I have known you for 3 years, Marek Vale. I have flown with you through worse than this and never once doubted you would be there when the smoke cleared. I am not confused. I am terrified, which is a different thing entirely, and I would rather be terrified with your hand around my tail than terrified alone in a corner pretending I'm not." He looked down at where her tail lay curled trustingly in his palm. Soft, warm despite the cold room, trembling with each retreating rumble of thunder, and he understood that he had a choice to make, right now, about what kind of person he was going to be in this moment, and every moment after it. He closed his hand gently around her tail, careful, the way you might close your hand around something you had been told, your whole life, was made of glass, and discovered instead was simply alive and afraid. "Okay," he said. "I've got you. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not letting go until you tell me to." Something in her shoulders came down, an inch, maybe 2, the way a held breath finally leaves a body. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She leaned slowly, until her head rested against his shoulder, and the storm raged on outside the cracked window, and inside the ruined little office of an abandoned weather station. Marek Vale sat very still and held the whole trembling weight of Avenna Rook's trust in one careful hand. He talked to her. Not about anything important. He told her, low and steady, about the first time he'd flown as an engineer's assistant on a training craft and thrown up over the instrument panel, about his sister's terrible cooking, about a dog he'd had as a child that was afraid of its own shadow and had somehow still lived to be 16 years old, stubborn and useless and beloved. He talked because he sensed correctly that what she needed wasn't silence to fill with fear, but a human voice, steady, mundane, present, to anchor her somewhere that wasn't the mud outside Ashevale 20 years ago. Slowly, her breathing evened. Slowly, the trembling in her tail eased beneath his palm, until it lay there simply resting, warm and calm, an animal that had decided, provisionally, that it was safe. "You're very bad at flattering stories," she murmured eventually, eyes still closed. "A dog afraid of its own shadow. Riveting." "You're smiling," he said. "I can hear it in your voice." "I am not." "You are absolutely smiling." A pause. Perhaps slightly. He counted that as the single greatest professional achievement of his career, and meant it. They might have stayed like that until the storm genuinely passed, might have let the night simply be the private, unhurried thing it had become, if the jury-rigged transmitter on the roof hadn't chosen that moment to prove its worth. The comm unit Marek had left running in the main room crackled abruptly to life, a burst of static resolving, after a tense few seconds, into a voice frantic with urgency. "Anyone receiving, this is Syndro Relay, we have a mass casualty event, repeat, mass casualty event. A family transport went down in Kesson Valley approximately 40 minutes ago. We have confirmed survivors on the ground but no craft capable of reaching them in current conditions, if anyone is receiving this." Avenna's whole body went rigid beneath Marek's hand. For one terrible second he thought the shock of it might send her straight back into the paralysis he'd found her in. But instead, something else happened, something he watched with a kind of awe he didn't have adequate words for. Her tail, still resting in his palm, went taut with purpose rather than fear. Her ears snapped upright forward, hunting the signal. And her eyes, when she opened them, were the eyes of Captain Rook again. Clear, sharp, already 3 steps down a mental checklist he couldn't see. "How many survivors?" she said, already moving to stand, though her tail, he noticed, and would think about for a long time afterward, did not pull away from his hand. It simply lengthened with her, staying connected even as the rest of her transformed back into the pilot the whole corridor told stories about. Marek reached for the comm unit, and keyed it. "Syndro Relay, this is Rescue 7, we copy your distress call, please advise survivor count and location, over." "Rescue 7, thank God, we make it 11 survivors, 3 critical, they're on the eastern slope near the old switchback road. The transport was carrying 2 families relocating to the Highland settlements. We cannot get anyone else in the air, the storm's grounded every other craft in the sector, we're the only asset in range." Avenna finished, when the transmission cut. Her voice had gone flat and fast, the voice she used for triage, for the moments when feeling anything would cost time she didn't have to spend. "Eastern slope, Kesson Valley? That's directly through the worst of the front." "Avenna." Marek stood too, close enough that his hand, when it finally released her tail, did so slowly, deliberately, a choice rather than a retreat. "You don't have to be the one who flies this." "There is no one else who flies this," she said. "I checked the roster before we ever left this morning, out of habit. Every other rescue craft in range is grounded or already committed elsewhere. It's us or it's nobody, and if it's nobody, there are 11 people on a mountainside who are going to spend the rest of their lives, however long that turns out to be, the same way I spent that night in the mud." He heard underneath the professional calm exactly what that sentence cost her to say. "Avenna, I need to say this once and then I'll stop. You don't owe those people your own nightmare. There's no shame in." "I know there's no shame in it," she said, and for a moment her mask cracked again, just slightly, just enough to let him see the fear still sitting there beneath the resolve, twin things occupying the same small space inside her. But I have spent 20 years building myself into someone capable of doing exactly this, Marek. If I don't fly tonight, into this storm, for these people, then everything I built myself into was a story I was telling myself. I need to know it's real. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who an hour ago had been curled beneath a control console, tail wound tight enough to strangle itself, and who now stood in the doorway with her spine straight and her ears forward, choosing, with her eyes wide open, to fly directly back into the thing that had broken her life apart once already. Then I'm flying with you, he said. Same as always. Same as always, she agreed, and something passed between them in that moment that neither of them named, because there wasn't time, and because some things don't need naming to be understood. The craft's engines caught on the second attempt, coughing to life against wind that hit the fuselage like something with intent. Avenna took the yoke with hands that Marek noticed, because he was noticing everything about her now, in a way that felt both new and long overdue, were not quite steady. Talk me through the approach vector, she said, as they lifted off the cracked pad and immediately staggered sideways in a crosswind that made Marek's stomach drop. Kessin Valley switchback, eastern slope. We're looking at a 15-minute flight if the wind cooperates, 25 if it doesn't. He pulled up terrain data, reading her the numbers in the same clipped rhythm they'd developed across 3 years of missions. Ridge line on your left in about 4 minutes, keep your altitude above 800, I know this terrain. A crack of lightning split the windscreen's view into stark white and black, and Avenna's whole body flinched, visibly, unmistakably, before she wrestled the craft back onto heading with a correction so precise it looked, to anyone who hadn't spent the last hour with her, like nothing at all had gone wrong. Marek reached over without thinking and closed his hand over hers where it gripped the secondary yoke, not to take control, but simply to be there, a point of contact, the same anchor he'd offered an hour ago translated now into the language of a cockpit instead of a corner on the floor. I'm right here, he said. Same as the office. Same as always. You fly, I'll watch the storm, and between the two of us we've got the whole sky covered. She didn't answer, but her hand turned beneath his, just slightly, just enough to press back. The flight into Kessin Valley was, afterward, the thing Marek would remember least clearly and most completely, the particular paradox of trauma and adrenaline, where a memory becomes both a blur and a set of images burned in permanently. He remembered the lightning strobing the cockpit white every few seconds. He remembered Avenna's tail, which had found its way, at some point in the ascent, to curl loosely around his wrist where his hand rested on the console between them, not gripping now, not desperate, but present, an anchor line strung between two people doing the same impossible thing together. He remembered calling out headings and watching her adjust before he'd even finished the sentence, 3 years of shared cockpit rhythm compressing into instinct so tight it barely needed words anymore. He remembered the moment the valley opened beneath them, and the wreckage came into view, a transport craft crumpled against a rock outcropping halfway up the eastern slope, its hull scorched, a scatter of survivors visible in the beam of their landing lights, huddled together against a wind that was trying, with real malice, to finish what the crash had started. There, Avenna said, voice gone sharp and clear, every tremor burned away by purpose. I see them. Marek, I need a landing zone. Working on it. There's a flat shelf about 40 meters upslope from the wreck. It's tight but it should hold our gear. 40 meters in this wind is going to feel like 400. I know. I trust you anyway. She looked at him, one fast, fierce glance, gone before he could properly read it, and then put the craft into a descent that made his stomach drop somewhere below the landing gear. What followed was, by any objective measure, the finest piece of flying Marek had witnessed in 3 years of watching a legend work, and he understood, even in the middle of it, even with his hands full of rigging lines and his voice hoarse from shouting headings over the wind, that he was watching something that mattered far beyond the immediate lives being saved. He was watching Avenna Rook fly into the exact shape of her own worst nightmare, and refused to let it own her. She set the craft down on the narrow shelf with a precision that left no margin and needed none, cutting the engines to idle the instant the gear kissed rock. Marek was out of his harness and into the storm before the whine of the rotors had fully died, scrambling down the scree toward the huddled survivors with a medical kit slung across his back and Avenna 2 steps behind him, already calling out in the calm, carrying voice she used for exactly these moments. The voice that told frightened people, without any wasted words, that help had arrived and knew precisely what it was doing. "I need everyone who can walk to start moving toward the craft in pairs," she called, sweeping her light across the huddled group. "Anyone who can't walk, stay exactly where you are, we're coming to you, don't try to move on your own." There were 11 of them, as reported. 2 families, half a dozen children among them, one man with a badly broken leg splinted crudely by someone with more courage than training, an elderly woman drifting in and out of consciousness with a head wound that made Marek's stomach tighten with the particular fear of injuries you can't fix in the field. He worked fast, the way 3 years of Avenna's missions had taught him to work, triaging and stabilizing while she organized the walking survivors into a chain, hand to hand, moving them up the treacherous slope toward the craft 2 and 3 at a time. The storm did not let up to accommodate any of it. Lightning struck the ridge above them at one point close enough that Marek felt the hair on his arms lift, and he saw Avenna flinch, hard, whole body, the same flinch he'd seen in the office. And watched her breathe through it, in one ragged inhale, and keep moving, keep calling instructions, keep being exactly the person these terrified strangers needed her to be. "Second landslide risk," she shouted to him at one point, over the wind, gesturing at the saturated slope above the wreck with an expression that told him she recognized the danger in a way that went beyond professional assessment. "This ground's been getting hammered for hours. We need to move faster than careful." "Faster than careful is your specialty," he shouted back, and saw, even in the chaos, the flash of something like real fondness crossing her rain-slicked face. They loaded the last of the survivors, the elderly woman, stabilized as well as field conditions allowed, and the man with the broken leg, with 11 minutes to spare before the ground above the wreck let go with a sound Avenna had described to him only hours earlier. Not a crash, but a low, terrible clearing of the throat, followed by the whole slope sliding downward in a wave of mud and stone that buried the wreckage they had just pulled 11 lives out of. Avenna watched it happen through the cockpit window, her hand steady on the yoke, her tail, Marek noticed, glancing back from where he knelt tending to the injured in the cargo hold, wound tightly around the base of her own seat, an old habit reasserting itself in the aftermath of danger. But her voice, when she spoke, was calm. "Everybody's clear," she said, to no one and everyone. "Everybody's clear, and I got them out in time." It was not, Marek understood, a report she was making to command. It was a report she was making to a 7-year-old girl sitting in the mud outside Asheville, 20 years and a whole ocean of grief away, and it was the first time in that girl's life that the answer had come back different. The flight back to Single 3, once the survivors were secured and the immediate crisis had drained out of the cockpit like water from a cracked hull, passed in a silence that felt entirely different from the silence of the outbound leg. That silence had been full of dread. This one was full of something quieter and harder to name, the particular exhaustion that comes after doing something enormous, mixed with a kind of wonder neither of them seemed ready to speak aloud. The storm broke somewhere over the last ridge before Single 3, clouds tearing apart to reveal a sky gone the deep, scrubbed blue of early morning, stars still visible at the edges before the coming dawn could wash them out. Avenna guided the craft down onto the settlement's landing pad with the same easy competence she brought to every landing, but Marek noticed her hands trembling faintly on the controls even after the engines cut, an aftershock working its way out of a body that had spent the night doing battle with more than one kind of storm. The survivors were met by a small crowd of syndrome medics and relatives, tears and shouted names and the particular chaos of reunion that Marek had witnessed dozens of times and never once found himself unmoved by. Avenna stood at the base of the ramp watching it happen, Her tail curled loosely and calmly around her own leg. Not fear now, he understood, but something closer to peace, the tale of someone finally, if only briefly, at rest. You did that, Marek said quietly, coming to stand beside her. We did that. You flew into your own worst memory and pulled 11 people out of it. I just held the medical kit. You held considerably more than the medical kit, she said, and something in her voice made him look at her properly. Her ears had gone faintly pink at their edges, a Vulpine tell he'd learned, over 3 years, to associate with embarrassment she was too proud to name out loud. I haven't forgotten what I asked of you last night, Marek. I don't intend to pretend I didn't. I wasn't going to make you pretend. I know. She looked out at the settlement waking up around them, dawn light beginning to gild the edges of the mountains that, hours earlier, had tried their hardest to bury 11 strangers and very nearly the 2 of them along with them. I think that's rather the problem. He didn't ask what she meant. He suspected, from the particular careful way she said it, that she wasn't entirely sure herself yet, and he had learned, across the longest night of his professional life, exactly how much patience this woman deserved. They filed their reports. They ate a meal in the Syndrome mess hall that neither of them tasted, sitting close enough at the long table that their shoulders occasionally brushed, either one moving away from the contact. They were given quarters to rest in while the storm damage to their own craft's transmitter array was properly repaired, separate quarters, as regulation demanded, though Marek noticed Avenna lingered in the corridor outside his door for a moment longer than the situation strictly required before finally, reluctantly, retreating to her own room. He lay awake for a long time afterward, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, his palms still faintly warm with the ghost memory of her tail curled trusting around it, and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives at 3 in the morning after a night like the one he just survived, that he was in serious and probably irreversible trouble. He found her on the observation deck 2 hours before their scheduled departure, watching the last of the storm clouds dissolve into the pale gold of a clean morning. She hadn't slept either, by the look of her, the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the slightly too careful way she held herself, like someone conserving the last reserves of a night that had asked everything of her twice over. Couldn't sleep, he said, coming to stand beside her at the railing. No. She didn't look at him. Her tail, he noticed, moved restlessly against the deck railing, not the tight coil of fear, not quite the loose calm of the night before either, but something unsettled in between, a tail working through a question its owner hadn't finished asking herself. I keep waiting to feel differently than I do. How do you feel? Awake, she said after a moment. Genuinely awake, for the first time in longer than I can remember. Like some part of me has been asleep behind glass for 20 years, and last night the glass finally broke. She turned to look at him, and the morning light caught her eyes in a way that made something in his chest ache with a specificity he hadn't felt in a long time. I don't know entirely what to do with that. You don't have to know right away. That's a very patient thing to say to someone who spent the whole night with her tail wrapped around your wrist, and would very much like to pretend she has the composure to discuss it calmly. He laughed, surprised into it, and saw the corner of her mouth twitch in response. The real thing this time, not the careful professional version she usually allowed herself. For what it's worth, he said, I would have held on as long as you needed. Last night, and if it comes up again. It will come up again, she said. That's rather the trouble with a storm that lives inside your own skull, Marek. It doesn't file a flight plan. Then I guess I'm on call. Something shifted in her expression, surprise, he thought, and beneath the surprise something warmer, something that made her ears tilt toward him in the particular way he'd started, without quite admitting it to himself, to memorize. You understand what it means, she said carefully, for a Vulpine to offer their tail the way I offered mine last night. I need to know you understand it, and not just the polite version from a briefing packet. I understand it's not something you do lightly. I understand it's usually reserved for family. He hesitated, and then decided, the way he'd decided in the doorway of that ruined office, that honesty was worth more than caution here. I understand that whatever last night was, it wasn't nothing, and I don't want to pretend it was for either of our sakes. No, she agreed softly. It wasn't nothing. They stood in silence for a while after that, watching the sun finish its climb over the ridgeline, the sky clean and blue and entirely free of storms for the first time in what felt, to both of them, like a very long time. Avenna, Marek said eventually. The sky's clear. She glanced up at it, as though confirming the fact for herself, and then looked back at him with an expression he would spend the rest of his life being grateful he'd been there to see. I know, she said. I just haven't decided whether I'm finished holding on. And then, deliberately, without hesitation, without the tremor of fear that had accompanied the gesture the night before, she reached out and let the end of her tail curl, once more, around his open hand. This time, there was no storm to blame it on. They flew back to the corridor's main station 3 days later, once the transmitter array at the weather station had been properly repaired by a maintenance crew, and their own craft cleared for the return trip. Word of the Kessin Valley rescue had, predictably, already outpaced them. The 11 survivors had told their story to anyone who would listen, and Captain Rook's name was already threading its way back into the breakroom legends, embroidered with details that grew a little taller with each retelling. Marek let the stories run their course without correcting them. He knew, better than anyone, what had actually happened in that valley, knew the cost of it, and the courage underneath the courage everyone else saw. And he found he didn't need the wider corridor to understand what he understood. Some things belonged to the people who'd lived them, not to the legend built around them afterward. What changed, in the weeks that followed, was quieter than any legend. It was the way Avenna's tale, once carefully composed and professional during their shared shifts, now drifted, unconsciously, toward wherever he happened to be standing. It was the way she started arriving at the hangar earlier than her shift required, not because the pre-flight checks needed the extra time, but because, she admitted this to him one evening, with the particular bluntness she reserved for things that mattered too much to dress up, she liked the quiet hour before their shift began. When it was just the two of them, and the ordinary hum of the hangar, and no emergency demanding either of their attention. It was the evening, 3 weeks after Kessin Valley, when a summer thunderstorm rolled through the corridor's main station, an ordinary storm, nothing like the one that had trapped them at the weather station, nothing like the one that had buried a valley 20 years earlier, and Avenna, instead of retreating to hide it, walked the length of the residential corridor to Marek's door and knocked. I don't need you to hold my tail tonight, she said, when he opened it, and there was something almost shy in the way she said it, an admission dressed up as a joke. I think I could sit through this one on my own, if I had to. But I'd rather not have to, if the alternative is available. Her ears had gone that soft, betraying pink again. Is it available? He stepped back from the door to let her in, and understood, watching her cross his threshold with her tail already curling with quiet, deliberate intention toward his waiting hand, that whatever this was between them, whatever had been built in the wreckage of an old fear and the long night it took to survive it, it was not going to be undone by clear skies. They sat together at his window and watched the storm pass, her tail curled around his wrist the whole time, not from fear this time, but from something that had grown up alongside the fear and finally, patiently, outgrown it. 20 years, she said quietly, at one point, watching lightning flicker over the distant hills without flinching. 20 years I told myself the only way to survive a storm was to be the one who flew into it, and never let anyone see what it cost me. And now I think perhaps the bravest thing I've ever done wasn't flying into Kessin Valley. She looked at him, amber eyes soft in the low light, her tail tightening gently around his hand. It was sitting on the floor of a ruined office and letting someone see me be afraid. For what it's worth, Marek said, I've never respected you more than I did in that moment. Legend or not. I would have thought the legend mattered more to you. The legend flies well, he said. But it's the woman underneath it I'd walk into any storm for. She was quiet for a moment, and then, slowly, She leaned across the space between them and pressed her forehead briefly against his. A Vulpine gesture he'd seen exchanged between close family, tender and unhurried, an intimacy that asked for nothing and offered everything. "Then I suppose," she murmured, "you'd better get comfortable, Vale. Storm season's only just beginning, and I find I've grown rather fond of not facing it alone." Outside, the thunder rolled on, distant and unthreatening now, no longer the sound of a world clearing its throat, but simply weather, ordinary, survivable weather, passing harmlessly over two people who had, against every reasonable expectation, found in each other exactly the kind of shelter that no storm could ever take away. Word travels strangely on a station the size of the corridor's main hub, fast in some directions, glacially slow in others, and never quite along the paths you'd expect. It took nearly a month for anyone beyond the immediate flight crew to notice that Captain Rook and her flight engineer had begun eating every meal at the same table, arriving to shift within minutes of each other with a regularity that outstripped coincidence, and it took approximately 4 minutes after that first noticing for the entire hangar to have an opinion about it. "You're being watched," Marek observed, one morning, as they ran through the pre-flight checklist for a routine cargo run to the outer settlements. 2 junior engineers at the next berth over were making a poor show of not staring. "I am always being watched," Avenna said, without looking up from the fuel gauge readout. "It comes with being the person everyone tells stories about. I stopped noticing years ago. They're not staring at the legend today." That got her attention. She glanced up, followed his gaze to the junior engineers, who immediately became extremely interested in a bundle of cargo netting that did not require their interest. Her tail, which had been moving in the easy, unconscious rhythm of routine work, went very still. "Ah," she said. "Does it bother you?" "It bothers me that I find I don't mind as much as I expected to." She resumed her work, though he noticed her ears stayed angled toward the whispering engineers a moment longer than strictly necessary. "I have spent my whole career being extremely careful about what people are permitted to see. It's disorienting to discover I've stopped being careful without deciding to. For what it's worth, I haven't told anyone anything." "I know you haven't. You wouldn't." She said it with such simple certainty that something in his chest turned over, slow and warm. "It isn't the telling I'm worried about, Marek. It's what happens when they look at you and me together and draw the correct conclusion regardless of what either of us says about it." He set down his own instruments and gave her his full attention, the way he'd learned to when her voice took on that particular careful weight. "What conclusion is that?" "That Captain Rook, terror of every disaster in the corridor, allowed herself to be held." Her jaw tightened briefly, an old reflex fighting a new truth. "Some of my people will understand what that gesture meant, if it ever becomes common knowledge. Most of them will understand it better than the humans on this station do. And a Vulpine who learns that their captain offered her tail to a human outside her family will have opinions about it, Marek. Not all of them kind." He considered this carefully before answering, because he understood, even without her saying it outright, that this was the first time she had voiced the shape of a fear that had nothing to do with thunderstorms. "Are you worried about what they'll say to you?" he asked. "Or worried about what it would cost you to stop caring what they say?" She was quiet for a long moment, her tail resuming its restless movement against the deck plating. "Both," she admitted finally. "I have spent 20 years building a reputation that lets me walk into any room in this corridor and be taken seriously without question. I don't know what happens to that reputation once people decide the pilot who flies into burning ships needed a human to hold her hand through a thunderstorm. They'd be wrong," Marek said. "You didn't need anyone to hold your hand through the storm. You needed someone to trust with what the storm cost you. Those aren't the same thing. And anyone who can't tell the difference isn't worth the reputation you're worried about losing." Avenna looked at him for a long moment, something unguarded moving behind her eyes, and then, slowly, deliberately, in full view of the 2 junior engineers still pretending very hard to examine cargo netting, she let her tail drift across the space between their workstations and curl, briefly, warmly, around his wrist. "Let them talk," she said. I find I'm tired of managing everyone else's comfort with my own history. Behind them, the cargo netting was very thoroughly forgotten. The message arrived 8 weeks after Kesson Valley, routed through the corridor's civilian channel rather than the rescue service's operational frequency, which was how Avenna knew before she'd even opened it that it wasn't official business. My grandmother's sister, she explained to Marek, staring at the terminal with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, something that mixed dread and hope in proportions he couldn't quite untangle. Sorrel Ashvale. She's one of the last elders who remembers the old settlement firsthand. She wants to visit the station. Is that unusual? She hasn't left the Highland Enclave in 6 years. She doesn't travel for pleasantries. Avenna's tale had gone very still, the coiled stillness he'd learned, over the months since the weather station, to recognize as apprehension rather than fear. She's heard about Kesson Valley. I imagine she's heard other things as well. The elder arrived 3 days later. A small, silver-furred Vulpine woman with eyes the same amber as Avenna's and a bearing that made the entire hangar bay instinctively quiet as she passed through it, leaning on a carved walking stick that Marek suspected was more ceremonial than necessary. She embraced Avenna with a warmth that made something in Marek's chest ache on Avenna's behalf, a reminder of exactly how much family this woman had lost, and how precious the little that remained must be to her. Then the elder turned her attention to Marek, and her gaze was considerably less warm. You are the human, she said. It was not quite a question. Marek Vale, ma'am. I fly with your. He hesitated, unsure of the correct term for a great-aunt in Vulpine kinship structures, and Avenna, beside him, made a small, strangled sound that might have been amusement despite the tension in the room. He's my flight engineer, Avenna said. And he is the reason I am standing here at all, rather than having grounded myself permanently after Kesson Valley the way I nearly did after every storm before it. Sorrel studied Marek for a long, silent moment, her ears tilted in an assessment he couldn't read, and then her gaze dropped, deliberately, to Avenna's tail, which had curled, unconsciously, he realized, watching it happen, around the edge of his own sleeve, the way it had taken to doing whenever they stood close together. I did not come to approve or disapprove, Sorrel said finally, addressing Avenna rather than him, though he understood the words were meant for both of them. I came because word reached the Enclave that my grandniece finally let someone hold what she has carried alone since she was 7 years old, and I wished to see for myself whether it was true, or whether it was merely a story growing taller in the telling. It's true, Avenna said quietly. Then I have something to say to you, and I will say it once, because I am old and travel exhausts me and I have no patience left for repeating myself. The elder's amber eyes moved between them. Your mother was my sister's daughter. She would have wanted, more than anything else in this world, for you to stop punishing yourself for surviving her. I have watched you, from a distance, for 20 years, build yourself into a wall no storm could break, and I have grieved for you nearly as much as I grieved for her, because a wall cannot be loved the way a person can. Avenna's breath caught, audibly, and her tail tightened around Marek's sleeve. I do not know this human well enough to judge whether he deserves what you have given him. Sorrel continued, turning her gaze fully on Marek now, sharp and assessing in a way that made him feel, briefly, like a cadet under inspection. But I know that my grandniece has not looked this unguarded since she was a small child sitting at her mother's window counting the gap between lightning and thunder. Whatever you did in that weather station, human, you did something none of the rest of us managed to do in 20 years. See that you do not waste it. I don't intend to, Marek said, and meant it with his whole chest. Sorrel studied him a moment longer, and then, unexpectedly, the corner of her mouth curved into something that might, on a less formidable face, have been called a smile. Good, she said. Then perhaps you are not entirely unworthy of the tale, after all. Sorrel's visit, brief as it was, did what months of careful discretion had failed to do. It confirmed, beyond any hangar floor speculation, that something significant had grown between Captain Rook and her flight engineer, and the corridor, as corridors do, took a few weeks to process the information before settling, mostly, into acceptance. Not everyone settled kindly. There were a handful of older Vulpine crew members who regarded the pairing with the particular chilly politeness reserved for things one disapproves of but lacks standing to forbid, and Marek weathered more than one pointed comment in the mess hall about humans who didn't understand what they were taking on when they accepted a gesture that wasn't theirs by birthright to receive. He learned to let most of it slide off him, the way Avenna had spent years learning to let her own legends slide off her, but there was one exchange, 3 months after Sorrel's visit, that he carried with him longer than he expected to. It came from Denner Ashcroft, a senior maintenance chief who had flown rescue missions himself decades earlier, before an injury grounded him permanently. A Vulpine of the old school, gruff and exacting, who had never made any particular secret of his skepticism about interspecies pairings in general. "You understand what you've taken on," Denner said, cornering Marek in the parts locker one evening, without preamble. "The tale isn't a metaphor, boy. It's not a nice human sentiment translated into fox terms for your benefit. When she offered you that trust, she offered you the responsibility that comes with it, and that responsibility doesn't end when the storm does. I understand that. Do you?" Denner's ears flattened skeptically. "Rook's been flying into disasters since before you transferred onto this station, and everyone on this corridor has spent a decade telling themselves she doesn't need anybody, because that's a more comfortable story than the truth. You've seen the truth now. What happens the day you get tired of carrying it?" Marek considered the question seriously, because it deserved to be considered seriously, and because some part of him, the honest part, the part that had sat in a ruined office holding a trembling tail and understood exactly what was being asked of him, had already turned the question over more than once in the quiet hours before sleep. "I don't get tired of things that matter to me," he said finally. "I got tired of a lot of things before I transferred to this corridor. Desk postings. Careers that didn't ask anything real of me. I have never, not once, gotten tired of flying with Avenna Rook, and I don't expect that to change just because the thing she needs from me sometimes is quieter than a rescue mission." Denner studied him for a long moment, the way Sorrel had studied him months earlier, and something in the old maintenance chief's stance eased, fractionally. "She told the elder you were the reason she survived Kessin Valley without breaking," he said. "I flew rescues myself, before my leg gave out. I know exactly what it costs to fly toward the thing that already tried to kill you once. If you're half as steady as she says you are, boy, then perhaps this corridor got lucky the day they transferred you in." It wasn't quite an apology, and it wasn't quite approval either, but Marek understood, watching the old chief limp away, that it was as close as Denner Ashcroft was likely to come to either, and he found that he didn't need more than that. Vulpine courtship, Marek learned over the following months. Mostly from Avenna herself, in unhurried conversations that unspooled during the quiet hours between shifts, and partly from Sorrel, who took to sending him occasional messages of her own, brief and characteristically blunt, followed a structure both older and more deliberate than anything in human custom. There was no single moment of proposal, no ring, no formal date circled on a calendar. There was, instead, something called the choosing. A season-long process during which two people demonstrated, through accumulated small acts rather than grand declarations, that they intended to remain. "It isn't a performance," Avenna explained, one evening on the observation deck that had become, without either of them deciding it deliberately, their place. "It's not something you do for an audience. It's something you do for the other person, privately, until one day you both simply know it's finished. How do you know when it's finished? You just know." She smiled at his obvious dissatisfaction with that answer. "My grandmother used to say the choosing ends the way a storm ends, not with an announcement, but with a stillness you recognize the moment you feel it." Marek had spent enough months now studying the small, quiet language of Avenna Rook to understand that she was, in her own oblique way, telling him something important, and he had spent enough of his life learning patience from her to let the understanding arrive in its own time rather than forcing it. The stillness, when it came, arrived on an unremarkable evening nearly a year to the day after the weather station. No storm, no crisis, nothing but an ordinary sunset, and the two of them sharing a meal in his quarters after an uneventful supply run. Avenna set down her fork partway through the meal, went very quiet, and looked at him with an expression he had learned by now meant she had arrived somewhere important in her own thoughts and needed a moment before she could say it aloud. "I have been choosing you for 11 months, she said finally, "without ever telling you that was what I was doing, because I wasn't certain, at first, that I had the right to ask it of you, given everything I brought into it. I think I have been afraid that admitting the choosing out loud would mean admitting how thoroughly I have already decided. And now I find the stillness has arrived, and I am tired of not naming it." Her tail, resting easily across her own lap since dinner began, lifted and reached across the small table between them, coming to rest, deliberate and unhurried, against his open palm, the same gesture, the same trust, offered now not out of fear but out of certainty. "Marek Vale. I am finished choosing. I choose you, storm season and clear skies both, for as long as you'll have me." He closed his hand gently around her tail, the way he had that first terrified night, and felt the difference between then and now settle into his chest like something finally arriving home. "I chose you the night you handed me your tail and trusted me not to drop it," he said. "I just didn't know there was a name for it yet." It would have been a tidier story if Avenna's fear had simply ended the night she flew into Kesson Valley. If courage, once proven, stayed proven, the way a debt is settled once paid. Marek understood, long before it happened, that this was not how healing actually worked, and so he was not entirely surprised, 6 months into their choosing, when a second true test arrived to measure whether anything they'd built together could hold. It came in the form of a distress call eerily similar in shape to the one that had sent them into Kesson Valley. A settlement transport, a mountain pass, a storm system moving faster than the forecasts predicted, except this time the settlement in question was Highfall, a highland community less than 30 kilometers from the buried ruins of Ashvale itself. Avenna went very still when the coordinates came through on the calm display, her tail freezing mid-motion in a way Marek hadn't seen since the night at the weather station. "Avenna. I'm fine." The words came too fast, too automatic, the old armor reasserting itself out of pure reflex. "Give me the survivor count." 23, mostly children, a school transport caught in flash flooding from the storm runoff. Marek kept his voice level, watching her carefully. "Avenna, look at me a second." She did, and he saw it immediately, not the paralyzed terror of the weather station, but something almost worse in its way. A fierce, brittle determination that was trying, visibly, to outrun a fear rather than sit with it the way she'd learned to do in the months since. "I can do this," she said, more to herself than to him. "I did it once already. I don't need to feel anything about it this time, I just need to fly the route. You don't have to prove you're fixed, Avenna. That's not how this works, and you know that better than anyone. I don't have time for a conversation about my feelings, Marek. There are 23 children on a bus in a flash flood. I know. I'm not asking you to stop and process anything. I'm asking you to let me hold the part of this that's mine to hold, the same as always, instead of trying to carry all of it alone because you're afraid that needing help twice makes the first time a fluke." That landed. He watched it land, watched something in her shoulders loosen by exactly the degree necessary to keep flying safely instead of flying angry, which he had learned, over their years together, was the more dangerous of the two. "Fly with me," she said, quieter now, more herself. "Same as always." "Same as always," he agreed, and they were airborne within 4 minutes. The flight to Highfall took them directly over the buried scar of Ashvale, visible even through the storm as a long, pale wound across the mountainside where nothing had grown back in 20 years. Avenna's eyes flicked toward it once, briefly, and Marek saw her jaw tighten, but her hands stayed steady on the yoke, and her voice, when she spoke, carried none of the brittleness from moments before. "I used to think," she said over the headset, quiet enough that it might have been meant only for herself. That flying past this place would always feel like flying past a grave. It still does. But it doesn't feel like flying past the grave I'm about to join anymore. It just feels like flying past the place I survived. That's new. That's you, she said simply, and banked the craft toward Highfall with hands that did not shake. The rescue itself, when it came, was almost anticlimactic after the build-up of dread. A straightforward if harrowing operation. The school transport pulled free of rising floodwater with 11 minutes to spare. 23 frightened children and 2 exhausted teachers delivered safely to the Highfall relief shelter without a single serious injury among them. Avenna flew every second of it with the same precision the whole corridor already knew her for, but Marek, watching from the co-pilot's seat, saw something different in how she did it this time. Not a woman outrunning her own history, but a woman who had made peace with carrying it, flying anyway, because the peace and the fear could occupy the same chest without either one needing to win outright. It was only after, back at Highfall's relief shelter with the last child reunited with a sobbing parent, that the second storm, the one inside her, finally caught up. Avenna excused herself to the edge of the landing pad, ostensibly to check the craft's fuel readouts, and Marek found her there minutes later with her tail wound tight around her own wrist and her shoulders shaking, silently, in the aftermath of adrenaline finally releasing its grip. He didn't ask if she was all right. He simply sat down beside her on the wet tarmac, exactly as he had on the floor of that ruined office more than a year earlier, and waited. "I flew past Ashevale," she said eventually, "and I didn't fall apart. I want that to mean something enormous, and instead it mostly just makes me tired. It's allowed to mean something enormous and be tiring at the same time. When did you get so wise about the inside of my head, Vale?" "About a year and a half ago," he said. "Ruined weather station. Very memorable evening." That surprised a real laugh out of her, thin and shaky but genuine, and her tail, trembling less now, the tremor settling by degrees, uncurled from her own wrist and found his hand instead, the way it had learned to do whenever the world asked too much of her at once. "I don't think the fear ever fully leaves," she said, quieter. "I used to believe healing meant arriving somewhere it couldn't reach me anymore. I don't think that's true. I think it just means I no longer have to face it by myself. That's not a consolation prize, Avenna. That's the whole thing. That's what everyone spends their whole life hoping to find." She looked at him for a long moment, rain-damp and exhausted, and he thought, more beautiful than any legend the corridor had ever told about her, and pressed her forehead gently against his the way she had the night of the first true storm they'd weathered together. "Then I suppose," she murmured, "I found it rather early, and rather by accident, in a building nobody had used for a decade. Best accident of my life," Marek said, and meant every word of it. News of the Highfall rescue reached Sorrel before Marek and Avenna had even finished their post-mission debrief, carried, as these things always seemed to be, faster than either of them expected through channels either of them controlled. The elder's response arrived within the day, not another visit this time, travel being the ordeal it was for her, but a message, brief and characteristically direct, that Avenna read twice before passing the terminal silently to Marek. "You flew past your mother's grave and did not break," it read. "Your grandmother would tell you this proves nothing you did not already know, that you were always capable of carrying what happened to us, and simply needed someone willing to help you set it down when the weight became too much for one set of hands. I am glad, at last, that you have found such hands. Bring him to the Enclave when the season turns. It is time the rest of the family met the man who taught our girl that surviving and healing are not the same accomplishment, and that she is finally permitted both. She wants to meet you properly," Avenna said unnecessarily, watching his face as he read it. "Properly meaning the Enclave." "Meaning my grandmother's remaining sisters, and my brother, who survived that night beside me and has never quite forgiven himself for being too young to help carry our parents out, and probably 3 or 4 elders who will study you exactly the way Sorrel did and expect you to hold up under it." She said this with the particular dryness she reserved for things that mattered enormously to her. It is, in effect, an invitation to be measured by the entire surviving fragment of my family, to determine whether you're worthy of the tale you've already been holding for a year and a half. Should I be nervous? Terribly, she said, and then, softening, added, but I find I'm not nervous on your behalf, which surprises me more than I can adequately express. I have never once, in my life, wanted to bring someone home to be measured by what's left of Ashvale. I find I want it now more than I've wanted almost anything. The Enclave visit, when it came, unfolded over 3 days in the Highland settlement where the last scattered survivors of Ashvale had eventually resettled, a smaller, more cautious community than the one the landslide had taken, built with the particular care of people who had learned, at enormous cost, exactly how much the mountains could take from them if given the chance. Marek met Avenna's brother, Tavern, a quiet, serious man 3 years her junior who studied Marek with an intensity that made the earlier scrutiny of Sorrel and Denner feel almost gentle by comparison, and who did not soften toward him until the second evening, when Avenna excused herself briefly and Tavern, alone with Marek for the first time, finally spoke plainly. She used to have nightmares every storm season, Tavern said without preamble, staring into the fire rather than at Marek. Every single year, without fail, for as long as I can remember. This year the messages I get from her during storm season don't sound the same. They sound like someone who's frightened and not alone in it, instead of someone frightened and pretending otherwise for my benefit. He looked up finally, amber eyes so like his sister's that Marek felt the family resemblance land in his chest like a small shock. I don't know you well enough yet to trust you completely. But I know my sister well enough to trust what I'm hearing in her voice, and that will have to be enough for tonight. It was, Marek thought, exactly the kind of cautious, hard-won trust that a family who had lost everything once already would offer, not blind, not effusive, but real, and worth every bit of patience it took to earn. By the final evening, gathered around the Enclave's communal fire while 3 elders traded stories about the old settlement that Avenna listened to with an open, unguarded attention Marek had never seen her allow herself before, Sorrel leaned toward him and spoke quietly, for his ears alone. You have noticed, I think, that she has not once flinched at the thunder these 3 days, though we've had 2 storms pass over the Enclave since you arrived. Marek glanced across the fire at Avenna, laughing at something her brother had said, her tail curled loosely and contentedly around her own leg rather than braced for danger, and understood that Sorrel was right. I notice, he said. Good, the elder said. Then you understand what you've built together, and I need not spend my remaining years worrying whether my grandniece chose wisely. She patted his hand once, briskly, in a gesture that from her, he'd come to understand, constituted enormous affection. Welcome to what's left of our family, human. We are smaller than we once were, but we are fierce about what remains, and I think you'll find we've decided to be fierce about you as well. If the story had needed a villain, the corridor would have been happy to supply one out of gossip alone, but the real threat to what Marek and Avenna had built came from somewhere far more mundane than any rival or any storm. A routing memo from Sector Command, 3 months after the Enclave visit, reassigning senior rescue captains across the wider Kessin corridor network to address a shortage 2 systems over. Avenna's name was on the list. 6 months, she said, staring at the terminal with an expression Marek hadn't seen on her since the weather station. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, a old habit of bracing for loss reasserting itself out of pure reflex. A temporary command posting at Dorven Station, minimum 6 months, possibly longer if the shortage doesn't resolve. They want experienced captains who've handled complex multi-casualty events. Apparently Kessin Valley made the list of qualifying incidents. Can you decline it? I could. It would be noted in my file as a professional limitation, and everyone who's ever whispered about the human flight engineer softening the legendary Captain Rook would have their proof. She said it without real bitterness, more as a fact to be weighed than a wound to nurse, but Marek heard, underneath it, the old fear finding a new shape to wear. Not thunder this time, but distance, and the particular terror of a woman who had spent 20 years believing that anything she loved could be taken from her without warning. You should take it, Marek said, and watched her head snap up in surprise. Not because I want 6 months apart from you. Because you built your whole career on being the person capable of handling exactly this kind of assignment, and I'm not going to be the reason you turn it down. You'd be entirely justified in asking me not to go. I know. I'm choosing not to ask. He came to sit beside her, taking her hand the way he had 100 times since the weather station, though this time there was no tail curled around his wrist, only the tense set of her fingers gripping his. Avenna, I didn't fall in love with a woman who stays grounded to keep me comfortable. I fell in love with someone who flies toward the thing everyone else runs from. Taking that away from you to keep you close would make me exactly the kind of person I promised myself, the night you handed me your tail, that I would never be. You could request a transfer alongside me. I could. Dorven doesn't have an opening for a flight engineer with my specific rating, not for another 8 months at minimum. I checked the same afternoon the memo came through, because I wanted the option available even if we decided against it. He watched something in her face soften at that, the evidence that he'd already been quietly working the problem from his end without waiting to be asked. So here's what I think we actually do. You take the posting. I stay here, keep flying with whoever command assigns as interim captain, and we survive 6 months the ordinary way people survive distance. Badly, at first, and then less badly, until you're home again. That's not the tidy solution I was hoping to find. No, he agreed. But I think we've established, rather thoroughly, that we don't need tidy. We need real, and honest, and worth the discomfort. This qualifies. Avenna was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing an absent pattern across the back of his hand, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular steadiness she reserved for decisions that mattered too much to make lightly. I flew into Kessin Valley terrified I would lose myself to the storm the way I lost my parents to it, she said. I don't think 6 months at Dorven frightens me even a fraction as much, and I find that rather remarkable, considering how much smaller a professional posting is than a landslide. She looked up at him, amber eyes clear. I think it's because I know, this time, exactly what I'm flying back to. Then take the posting. I will. A small, wry smile. Try not to let the hangar gossip get too creative in my absence, Vale. I'd rather not return to find myself married off to 3 different rumored suitors before I've even landed. No promises, he said. Denner's already started a betting pool on how long you'll last before you request emergency leave to come home early. Has he? Her tail, he noticed, had finally uncoiled from its tense stillness, drifting instead toward his wrist in the old familiar gesture. Tell him I intend to win that bet by not requesting leave at all, and then tell him I intend to be insufferable about it when I return. The 6 months at Dorven Station passed in the particular rhythm of distance, long silences punctuated by messages that arrived at odd hours across the gap between star systems, each one a small, deliberate act of reaching across a darkness either of them pretended was comfortable. Avenna's early messages were clipped and professional, the habit of 20 years of guarding herself reasserting itself under the strain of separation, and Marek recognized the pattern for what it was without taking it personally, not retreat, but reflex, the same reflex that had once kept her curled beneath a control console rather than admit she was afraid. He answered every clipped message with something unguarded of his own. A description of an ordinary shift, a joke about Denner's ongoing betting pool, a simple line reminding her that distance didn't change what waited for her at the other end of it, and slowly, over the weeks, her replies began to soften back into the woman he'd come to know at the weather station and after. Storm season starting here, she wrote, for months in a message that arrived at an hour that told him she'd sent it rather than sleep. First real one hit last night. I sat through it alone in my quarters, and it wasn't easy, but it wasn't the weather station either. I kept thinking about what you said, that the fear doesn't have to leave to be survivable. I think I finally believe that, even 3 systems away from the person who taught it to me. He wrote back the only thing that felt true. I'm glad you didn't need me there to prove it. I'm glad you thought of me anyway. 6 weeks, Avenna? I'm counting. So am I, she answered. For the first time in my life, counting down to something doesn't feel like waiting for a rescue that isn't coming. It feels like waiting for one I already know is on its way. The posting extended, in the end, by 3 additional weeks beyond the original 6 months. A final complex rescue near Dorven's outer settlements that required Avenna's specific expertise, a mission that made the sector-wide bulletins for the sheer number of lives pulled from a collapsing mining platform, and that Marek watched unfold from 3 systems away with his heart in his throat and absolute confidence in exactly how it would end, because he had learned, over 4 years of flying beside her and 18 months of loving her, precisely what Avenna Rook was capable of when the sky tried its worst. She came home on a grey, unremarkable morning that turned, the moment her transport cleared the corridor's main docking bay, into the single best morning of Marek's life. He was waiting at the gate, had been waiting for nearly 2 hours, if he was honest with himself, unable to make himself do anything else. And when she came through the arrivals corridor, tired and travel-worn and utterly, completely herself, her tail found his hand before either of them had said a single word. 9 months, she said, into his shoulder, once he'd pulled her into an embrace that drew no small amount of hangar-floor attention, and that neither of them cared about in the slightest. I counted every single one of them. So did I, Marek said. Welcome home, Captain. Home, she repeated, testing the word, and he felt her smile against his shoulder. I don't think I ever properly understood what that word meant until you were the one saying it to me. The Vulpine bonding rite, the ceremony that formally closed the completed choosing, was called, and the old tongue sorrel still preferred for matters of consequence, the vesicalith, the binding of tails, and it was, Avenna warned Marek repeatedly in the weeks leading up to it, considerably less private than either of them might have preferred. The whole enclave attends, she said for perhaps the 3rd time, watching him adjust an unfamiliar ceremonial collar in the mirror of their shared quarters. Sorrel insisted, and once Sorrel insists on something, arguing is largely decorative. Tavern will officiate since he's the closest living family I have, and there will be an uncomfortable number of elders scrutinizing whether you tie the ceremonial knot correctly, which, for the record, I have been teaching you for a week, so there is no excuse for fumbling it. I haven't fumbled it once in practice. Practice and an audience of 40 judgmental Vulpine elders are different disciplines, Vale. The ceremony itself took place at the enclave, beneath a sky that had, with a symmetry either of them commented on but both privately noticed, gathered a light and entirely gentle rain by the time the guests assembled. Nothing like the storm that had first brought them together, but enough to dampen the gathered wildflowers and lend the whole afternoon a soft, washed clarity that felt, to Marek, like the sky itself offering its blessing. Tavern spoke first, in the old tongue and then in the common one for Marek's benefit, a short, formal recitation about the history of the rite. How it had begun, generations ago, as a promise between hunting partners who trusted each other with their lives in the field, and had grown, over centuries, into the promise between mates, that whatever storm arrived, literal or otherwise, either partner would face it with their tail wound alone around themselves ever again. Avenna Rook, Tavern said, when the recitation was finished, do you offer your tail freely, without fear, to this human, for every storm that comes after this one? I do, Avenna said, and her voice did not shake at all, not the way it had at the weather station, not even the small careful tremor of the observation deck a year and a half earlier. She said it the way she flew, steady, certain, utterly without hesitation, and Marek felt something in his chest crack open with a happiness too large for the small ceremonial space to comfortably hold. Marek Vale, Tavern continued, turning to him. Do you accept this tale, and everything it carries, and promise to hold it steady through every storm that finds her, for as long as you both shall fly? I do, Marek said. I have from the first night she trusted me with it, and I will for every night after this one. The ceremonial knot. A simple, elegant braid of ribbon around the joined length of Avenna's tail and Marek's wrist, tied by Tavern's steady hands while the assembled enclave watched in a silence that felt, to Marek, less like scrutiny now and more like reverence. Took less than a minute to complete, and undid, in that same minute, 20 years of a woman believing she had to survive every storm alone. When it was finished, Sorrel stepped forward from the gathered crowd, leaning on her ceremonial stick, and pressed her forehead first against Avenna's and then, with a gentleness that surprised him, against Marek's own. "Welcome, truly, to what remains of Ashvale," the elder said, loud enough for the whole gathering to hear. "We are a small family, built from what a mountain once tried to take entirely. We have learned, the hard way, exactly how precious it is when something survives a storm intact. Guard what you have built together as fiercely as we have guarded what remains of what we lost, and I believe the two of you will weather anything the sky decides to send." The rain, as if on cue, chose that exact moment to ease into a soft, watery sunlight, and Avenna, flower-crowned, ribbon-bound, radiant in a way Marek had never once seen the legendary Captain Rook allow herself to be in front of an audience, laughed, bright and unguarded, and pulled him into a kiss that the entire enclave cheered for with an enthusiasm that made even the most skeptical elders smile. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, the enclave's communal fire built up high against the cooling mountain air, tables of highland food laid out with the particular abundance of a community that had learned never to take gathering for granted. Marek found himself, at various points in the evening, deep in conversation with a rotating cast of Avenna's extended family, cousins twice removed who wanted to hear, in exhaustive detail, the story of the weather station. Elderly aunts who examined the ceremonial knot at his wrist with the critical eye of women who had tied 100 such knots in their lifetimes and pronounced this one, grudgingly, adequate. A pack of Vulpine children, Tavern's own among them, who had appointed themselves guardians of Marek's tail-holding technique and insisted on testing his grip against their own small, wriggling tails until they were satisfied he'd pass any storm that came his way. "They've adopted you," Avenna observed, finding him surrounded by the small delighted crowd of children near the fire, her own tail curling contentedly around the base of a nearby chair as she watched. "I think Tavern's youngest just informed me that I'm now obligated to attend every festival for the rest of my natural life." "You are. I'd apologize, but I find I'm not sorry in the slightest." She settled beside him, leaning into his side with the easy, unguarded comfort of someone who had finally, fully, stopped counting the cost of wanting closeness. "A year and a half ago I would have told you I had exactly the family I needed and no room in my life for expanding it. I find myself remarkably glad to have been wrong. For what it's worth," Marek said, "I've never had a family this loud, or this fierce, or this thoroughly willing to interrogate a man's tail-holding technique in front of 40 relatives." "Get used to it," Sorrel said, passing behind them with a bowl of Highland stew and no apparent shame about eavesdropping. "We intend to be considerably louder at the next gathering, once the two of you finally get around to giving Tavern's children a smaller cousin to boss around." Avenna's ears went a brilliant, betraying red, and Marek laughed until his ribs ached, and somewhere beyond the firelight the last of the day's gentle rain gave way, finally and completely, to a clear mountain sky scattered thick with stars. The same sky, Marek thought, that had once watched over a much darker night 20 years earlier, and now, at last, watched over something that had grown, patiently and against every reasonable expectation, out of that old wreckage into something whole. 1 year later. The plaque at Ashvale, what remained of it, a small marker erected years after the landslide by survivors who wanted the settlement remembered, if not rebuilt, sat quiet under a mild autumn sky the day Avenna finally returned to it, Marek at her side, her tail curled easily and without fear around his hand the entire walk up the overgrown terrace path. "I haven't been back," she admitted, standing before the marker with her family's names etched into stone gone soft with weather. "Not once, in 20 years. You don't have to stay long." "I know." She was quiet for a while, her tail tightening briefly and then, deliberately, relaxing again, a choice, he understood now, rather than an instinct. "I think I wanted them to know that the storm didn't win. That I built something out of what it broke, and that I finally let someone help me carry it." Marek said nothing. Some moments didn't need him to fill them with words, some moments only needed him to stay steady and present, exactly as he had that first night in the ruined weather station, holding on for as long as she needed him to. Above them, clouds gathered lazily along the ridgeline. The ordinary, unthreatening kind, the kind that might, later in the day, produce a gentle and forgettable rain, and Avenna Rook, rescue pilot, survivor, and finally, after 20 years, a woman no longer waiting alone in the dark for someone to come, tilted her face up toward the changing sky without a trace of fear. "Let it storm," she said softly, and slid her tail more securely around Marek's hand. "I've got someone to hold on to now." They stayed at the marker a while longer, long enough for the lazy clouds to thicken and eventually make good on their threat, a soft, unhurried rain beginning to fall over the overgrown terraces, dampening the stone and the wildflowers that had, in 20 years, finally reclaimed the scarred hillside in patches of stubborn color. Avenna didn't move to leave. She simply turned her face up into it, eyes closed, and let it fall. "You're getting soaked," Marek pointed out, though he made no move to hurry her either. "I know." A small, contented smile. "I used to hate the rain almost as much as the thunder, you know. It always came first. The warning before the warning." She opened her eyes, amber and clear and entirely present, none of the old flinch waiting behind them. "I find I don't mind it anymore. I think I finally let it just be rain." "What changed?" "You ask me that as though you don't already know the answer, Vale." She laced her fingers loosely through his, tail curling in its now familiar path around his wrist, an anchor that had long since stopped needing the excuse of fear to justify its presence there. "I stopped needing to survive the weather alone. It turns out that was the only part of it that was ever truly unbearable." They walked back down the overgrown terrace path as the rain settled into a steady, gentle rhythm, past the last of the old foundation stones half swallowed by grass, toward the small transport that would carry them back to the enclave, where Tavern and the elders were waiting, and beyond that, to the corridor, where a dozen new missions and 100 ordinary days waited in equal measure. The whole unglamorous, unremarkable, precious future of two people who had built something steady enough to weather anything the sky decided to throw at it. Storm season came again, as it always did, 6 months later. And when the thunder rolled in over the corridor's main station on a night neither of them had scheduled a flight, Avenna did not hide beneath a console or wait alone in the dark. She simply crossed the short distance to where Marek sat reading, curled herself against his side with the unhurried confidence of someone who had long since stopped needing to ask permission for the comfort she wanted, and let her tail find his hand the way it always did now, not out of fear, not even really out of habit anymore, but out of something far simpler and far harder one than either, the plain, quiet certainty of having somewhere safe to land. "Storm's picking up," she murmured, listening to the rain hammer the window. "Let it," Marek said, and closed his hand gently around her tail. "I've got you." Outside, the thunder rolled on, and neither of them so much as flinched.